Then it's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Professor Alan Tully will be speaking about Quaker Philadelphia and the development of pluralism. Professor Tully is a professor and chair at the History Department of the University of Texas at Austin, where he holds the Eugene C. Barker Centennial Professorship in American History. And I understand he's been pretty much running things for 15 years, but the good news is at the end of this year, he'll get to do more writing because I guess he gets to give up some of his administrative chores. He received his doctorate from Johns Hopkins University and is eminently known as a great scholar in early American history. He is the author of Forming American Politics, Ideals, Interests, and Institutions in Colonial New York and Philadelphia. That's from 1994. William Penn's Legacy, Politics and Social Structure in Provincial Pennsylvania from 1977. Culture and Identities in Colonial British America, also with Robert Alwell, 2006. And most recently, he has made a recent contribution to the Blackwell Encyclopedia of the American Revolution with an article on Ben Franklin in 2010. So again, it's really a great pleasure to welcome Professor Tully here from Texas, and please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, I am from Texas and have been there for a dozen years or so. Prior to that time, I was at the University of British Columbia for about 25 years and got a chance to think a little bit about the nature of American society from the periphery, as it were, which often is useful. First of all, I want to say that I'm extraordinarily pleased to be here, and I want to thank FPRI and the supporting institutes for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak, particularly to secondary school teachers. For the last few years, Humanities Texas and the University of Texas have put on a number of these kinds of institutes for secondary school teachers. And we find that it's extraordinarily encouraging for us who teach at the university to come in contact with those of you who in many ways I view as being out in the trenches. It's a tough job that many of you have, and any way that I can help to contribute to any bank of knowledge that you might have, I'm happy to do that. I prepared for this talk a series of documents, which is in a PDF. I didn't get it here in time for it to be sent to you all before this talk, but I know that the FPRI will either send it to you or I will in the near future. And partly I wanted you to have this today, or these documents, out of my talk today, because I'm going to take you on what I think for many of you will be somewhat more unfamiliar terrain than you had, for example, in Walter McDougall's talk in the first hour and a half. If in a sense, Walter's talk dealt with what I would call the kind of exoskeleton of the revolution and the adoption of a Republican entity, its development and so on, I'm going to take you down a kind of interior road, which is really the road of one of these provincial societies, Pennsylvania in this case. And I think it really is important for us to remember, and again, Walter touched on a little bit the fact that even in the early 1770s, the people who were involved in the revolution, they had no idea how this was all going to turn out. And many of them, if you'd asked them in 1770, 1772 about what they foresaw down the road, they wouldn't have had any kind of idea of how that would have panned out. What they came from was a large kind of Atlantic world, an Anglo-American world, but also a provincial world, worlds that were very separate, very distinct, very particular kinds of provincial polities and entities, which had developed, in some cases over 150 years. We forget that long period. I mean, the tendency often when you're teaching American history is to give, 2 lessons to, to Virginia, one each to Virginia and Massachusetts, one to maybe the French and Indian War and the Albany Congress, and then you're up in the Stamp Act crisis, and my goodness, then the revolution is there. If you stop and think about it, that's not the way it was. This was a long kind of period, long period of evolution, change, and the development of a kind of provincial identity in a very particular ways. And so what I want to do today is and one could do this with various colonies. Every colony has its own story, as it were. And everyone has distinct relationships among the people that make up that polity in the relationship to each other as that develops, and also, of course, in relationship to the larger Atlantic world. What I want to do, however, is, I'll trace some of these things, but I want to pay close attention to pluralism and to Pennsylvania. I think that there's the common way in which we deal with pluralism, I think. And that often has to do with the various kind of confederacy of interests that come together at the time of the Revolution and are thrashed out to some degree in the 1780s and then are a part of the Constitutional Convention and what rolls out after that. I think that's really important. And here, we get into the writings of Madison, we talk about Jefferson, the different kinds of sense of what was involved in creating a liberal society, a liberal Republican society, and to some degree a democratic society, although, again, there's, some question about the use of that term at that point and what exactly it means. So that's the common way. I think what I want to do today, however, is to talk about how pluralism, if you will, develops in Pennsylvania within a particular provincial context. And I think that tracing that, as I say, it's somewhat foreign ground because, again, Walter mentioned that quoted a historian saying, William Penn's up on City Hall, but people have forgotten him, and we don't really pay that much attention to that kind of story. Nevertheless, that's an extraordinarily important kind of a vantage point to take on this the evolution of a kind of plural society. Let me begin with in terms of the substance, with again reference to an individual, a man by the name of Dr. Alexander Hamilton, a physician, a Scot, came to Annapolis in 1739. And he practiced some in that area, and then became ill and decided he'd take a trip up through the colonies. And he left behind a record of that trip. It's been published by Carl Breidenbach, called The Itinerarium of Dr. Alexander Hamilton. And shortly after this trip took place in 1744, Hamilton recorded different stops north from Annapolis up to Philadelphia. And here's one of his writings from Philadelphia. Here he is in Philadelphia, May, I think, in 1744, maybe June of 1744. I dined at a tavern with a very mixed company of different nations and religions. There were Scots, English, Dutch, Germans, and Irish. There were Roman Catholics, churchmen, Presbyterians, Quakers, New Light men, Methodists, Seventh-day men, Moravians, Anabaptists, and one Jew. The whole company consisted of 25 planted around an oblong table in a great hall well stoked with flies. The company divided into committees in conversation. The prevailing topic was politics and conjectures of a French war. A knot of Quakers there talked only about selling of flour and the low price it bore. They touched a little upon religion, and high words arose among some of the sectaries, but their blood was not hot enough to quarrel or to speak in the canting phrase. Their zeal wanted fervency. Now here you have, this is 1744, this is Philadelphia. You have here a a record of a stranger walking into a tavern. And what he finds with what to him appears to be a very diverse group is a level of civility which he remarks upon. And he sees it very much, there's no question about it, as part of the tone of that city. And the question, for us in some ways is, how do we get there? How does this happen? And how is it carried on in some way? And what is its relation to a democratic society? How do we see this? I mean, there are different ways of talking about pluralism, and for want of a better term, it's simply the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of different expressions. In this case, of religion and ethnicity to some degree. And there is a legitimacy accorded in this kind of conversation in this world, but that's not easy to come by. And in particular, it's not easy to come by now, you might argue. It's not easy. It's always an issue of controversy, of contention. And contention is part of all of those kinds of relationships. But here, despite the heat of engagement and so on, there's this sense that still a conversation can go on among this very mixed kind of group. And the question is, again, how does this come about? How does it take place? How do we find it? What do we make of it? Well, I think that one thing is that if you look at the different colonies that we generally associate with British colonization, English colonization in the Atlantic, we see a whole variety of kind of social types, as it were, of organization. And historians, geographers, in fact, and geographic historians, I think, have as well as historians, have made efforts to classify these. And one of the best, I think, is done by a man named D.W. Meinig, in a book he calls the Geography of Early America. The Shaping of America, Geographical Perspective. He classifies colonies in the Atlantic world, in the Western Atlantic world, in this way. He talks about homogeneous kinds of colonies, and he lists Canada, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. He talks about pluralistic ones, and this is where Pennsylvania fits. Rhode Island, again, Walter mentioned Rhode Island. And I think that's a really interesting case. We could talk about that at some length. But it is small, and it is idiosyncratic in a very different kind of way, and it's clear that its kind of pluralism is very different, one might argue, from Pennsylvania. He talks about segmented societies, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, the Upper Hudson, the racially stratified, Texas, Florida, San Domingue, Louisiana, the biracial, Bermuda, Barbados, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and the complex, South Carolina, Georgia, and the lower Hudson. The point is that according to this kind of classification, and this is a thoughtful kind of effort to deal with this array of colonial experiences, I think that the point is that the pluralistic model, if you will, the emerging pluralistic society, is one that is rare here. And it really is a very distinctive feature of Pennsylvania in a very, again, unique kind of way. Robert Livingston, a well-known political figure and a lawyer in New York in the 1760s, compared at one point the dissonance of New York society to that of Pennsylvania. And he described Pennsylvania as a medley of all kinds of people and of all denominations. And the word medley is really important compared to that kind of sense of dissonance and contention that Livingston felt distinguished New York. And New York, indeed, I mean, you might argue New York is a pluralistic society in some ways, but the thing that's different about it is that it was a segmented society at the same time because of the huge tangle of different governmental, town, and social organizations that existed in the 67 years before you really begin to get a kind of established royal structure in government in the latter part of the 17th century. So the question is, how do we what are the contributors to this pluralistic world that Hamilton mentioned in 1744? Well, I think you have to go back here to understand what Philadelphia was and what it became, right to the beginnings. And we get some idea in one of the documents that I've given to you is William Penn's Some Account of the Province of Pennsylvania in 1681. Penn described the province at that time as a world that was filled with physical opportunity. It's a physical description of this place to which he is getting a charter. And he talks about it as a land filled with all of these kinds of benefits. Fertile land, wood, water, navigation, the availability of markets, both south, but particularly down to the West Indies as well. This, in a sense, is a land of opportunity, right from the very beginning. And we compare it to what we see outside. In fact, that doesn't work very well. I mean, what you have to do is go out into the countryside in Pennsylvania and to the surrounding area. And then you begin to see something of what Penn meant when he talked about these kind of visual attributes that this country offered. It was a compelling vision, and not the least of which was that in terms of latitude, it was down about the level of Naples in Italy, which sounded pretty good. I mean, it's a lot warmer if you stop and think about that. And so, what Penn is trying to do, of course, is he's presenting this place as a society for which in which there is a great deal of opportunity. And remember, this is a world in which scarcity is around the corner. Scarcity exists in all different kinds of ways in kind of hierarchical societies that existed in the Isles, the English Isles, the British Isles, and on the continent. And what this offers is not just a competency. It's not just the possibility of sufficiency. It's the possibility of all of those things, but also the possibility of some kind of market. What Penn then is he's, in a sense, he's an entrepreneur in his own way. At one point he said, I want some recompense for my troubles. And what that meant that Penn was in the colonization business. What he wanted to do was, and he made no bones about it. He essentially said, I want to get some money for my problems. Any of you who've read a little bit about him know that he had financial difficulties over time. And what he did was to appeal to the possibilities that others would see. The Some Account of Pennsylvania and later pamphlets, he sent them around, of course, not just around the British Isles, but he sent them over to the Low Countries, into what would become the Netherlands, or what was the Netherlands, and the Palatinate areas. And these pamphlets were published in Dutch, in German, French. Penn was in a sense an opportunist. But what he was appealing to was the sense of possibility that many people felt. And I think that we miss something very important if we don't recognize that at the very beginning. Penn also said, just as a part of that statement about wanting recompense for my troubles, the first part of the statement was, though I desire to extend religious freedom, yet I want some recompense for my troubles. The religious freedom had a priority, a very important one for Penn. And the question, of course, is why? What got him involved in this? How did this man become a religious figure, a religious leader in some ways. If you look at one of the famous paintings of Penn at the age of 22, you see him in armor, in fact. That's a very different Penn. And literally that was just is modeled upon a drawing apparently made of him, a sketch of him in 1666. And in 1667, at the age of 23, he converted to Quakerism. All right, he became a follower of George Fox and the Friends of Truth. The question is then, what did he convert to? And here I want to take you again down the road. There may be friends out here. I don't know, anybody in the audience? Chime in if there are. But I want to take you down a road which is extraordinarily important, and that's the road of the development of Quakerism to some degree. I want to go back and talk a little bit about Quaker ethos, what the Society of Friends represented and how that evolved to the point where Penn joins with them and then becomes a leader in his own right. If you cast, we've become so used to a multiplicity of religious views and within our context, at least, the legitimacy that's accorded them and so on. We don't think about this very much. But if you go back to the early 1600s and the 1500s, of course, we know that religion was extraordinarily contentious. That, we have the Reformation, we have the Counter-Reformation, we have the violence that accompanied all of that. And the prevalent kind of view in Penn's world, certainly up through his father's world, was that state and church should work together. They must be supporting, there must be a kind of uniformity within any given polity. And that's what occasioned so many different wars, if you will. This is a case where, the struggle to keep orthodoxy, to keep a state church in its supportive role with government as a centerpiece of the organization of society is crucial. And for Penn's world, of course, or what would become Penn's world, the crucial event was the English Civil War. In the 1640s, 1650s, the establishment, essentially, the church-state relationship split apart. And out of the kind of fractured crawled all of these sectaries of one sort or another. It's, Quakers are one, obviously, but levelers, of course, fifth monarchist men. We have a whole variety of people who essentially come out with ranters, seekers, and others. They're exploring the possibilities that is there in a world where there is not the kind of compulsion to belong to a state church any longer. We would use the term liberty. Many people, of course, at the time viewed it as license. It's the license to experiment. It's the liberty to experiment. Take your pick. The important thing is the lid is off. And you get this incredible kind of experimentation with what religion is. Well, what did the Quakers emphasize? In the 1640s, given the opportunity, and here with George Fox, of course, is the crucial figure, what the Quakers challenged was, and it was a challenge to begin with, they challenged church authority. They argued that unlike many of the recognized churches at the time, whether it be Catholic, Church of England, whatever, that the church essentially had perverted the nature of religion, had gotten away from primitive Christianity. And the church, whatever church it might be, passed on these false kinds of traditions and essentially took away from from Christianity, the kind of the essentials of a properly ordered kind of relationship among humans and the relationship with God. So the Quakers challenged church authority, but then they go further. Those of you who've read a little bit, and I'm sure a number of you have, given the importance of talking about Puritans, that Puritans, in effect, put a lot of emphasis on the Scripture. They tested church authority by scriptural authority. Well, the Quakers essentially said, no, the Scriptures, they're a little suspect as well. They're written by humans. This is not a question of direct divine revelation at all. This is these things are written by humans, and consequently they're subject to interpretation and error. So what they do is they challenge those sources of authority, and they challenge at the same time traditional doctrine, that have been a part of these different traditions for some time. The one that caused them the most trouble, and I'll mention it probably later again, is the notion of the Trinity. Quakers, they even at this point, they talked about the historic Jesus. But, there's this question about what the relationship of the historic Jesus is to God, to this Holy Spirit, if you will. And particularly it relates to, of course, to their conception of God as a unitary entity. And the metaphor, of course, that they use constantly is the solar one. God, essentially, and the Spirit comes from the central focus, or a focus from which light emanates into the individual. So the Quakers are they're essentially they break out of the mold in a powerful kind of way. And at the base of this, at the bottom of all this, is their notion that after the fall, post-lapsarian days, Christ's essence, and a small amount of Christ's essence inhered in each individual, that there's a sense there that there still is, in after the fall, a sense of godliness, of Christ in individuals. And basically what they argued, there's this kind of sense of inspiration. God speaks directly to individuals through that kind of essence within them. And hence their emphasis upon silence in the meeting house in particular. The fact that one should wait to be inspired by this kind of feeling of communion, if you will, with God. One must still oneself, in oneself, worldly voices. This is, and along with that, of course, went throwing they threw into the trash heap the notion of a clergy. They called clergy hireling priests. What they believed was that people who were inspired, and they believed not in formal education, but they believed in some kind of education. They wanted people to know the Bible as well. The Scripture was important, but the issue was the inspiration in the light of all of that. And out of this comes what they call their religious leaders, their public friends, those who proved themselves to be spokespersons for the religion for some time. This kind of notion of the essence of God being within individuals, it leads, of course, down the road very much to spiritual equality. And here's, we talk, and again, Walter mentioned the issue of equality and how important this is in some way as one of the contributors to American society. But here, fundamentally, is an extraordinarily powerful strand of equality. It inheres in the nature of religion. And you look at the way in which this played out, particularly in gender terms. Look, Quakers had women public friends. Margaret Fell was the cohort and ultimately the spouse of George Fox. And she was eminent in establishing women's meetings in which women essentially took control of some of the what they called the the clearing of people under different kinds of ordeals or different situations. They were also involved in poor relief to some extent. So, and you have teams of come back to public friends, you have teams of women, pairs who traveled around the Atlantic world, speaking their sense of what, the first publishers of truth were. So this is, this is a remarkable kind of thing. I mean, we don't understand the nature of it. We don't understand the power of this, and how Quakers appeared to be, so completely disruptive of the order in society at that point with this kind of belief and these kinds of practices. They believed, too, in what one would call the transformative nature of the time. They really thought in the 1640s that there was a chance that there would be established at this time the universal church, that they really were taking a lead in going back to primitive Christianity, which would sweep away these artificialities that came out of church authority and hierarchy and so on, and were able ultimately, they would ultimately be able to create a new kind of primitive church, a universal church. They rejected all kinds of social mores. I mean, these are people who refused, in a sense, to give what was called hat honor. If you met your superior on the road, you were to doff the hat, whatever. They refused to do that. It had to do with equality. They refused to take oaths because they had the essence of God within them. They should not take an oath. I mean, Christ, in their view, had said, and here they did use Scripture, I swear not at all. But more than that, oaths were for people who didn't believe that they had the essence within them, because Quakers were truth tellers in some way. It's the extent to which they gave expression to this kind of religious fervor was extraordinary in the context of the time. Now, you might argue, and rightly so, they're one of a number of groups, but they represent this kind of very well, this kind of development in religious practice. I'll give you an example of how one of the documents did get passed around. I think it's on here. Yes. You have this journey to Pennsylvania in the year 1750. If you look to the very back page, I think here. Let me just read to you for a second. In Pennsylvania, the following custom prevails. This was a piece by a German immigrant who came over to Pennsylvania, then returned to the Low Countries in the mid-century, 10, 12 years after Hamilton made his comments. In Pennsylvania, the following custom prevails among all people, high and low in the city and in the country. When anyone enters a house or meets another, he first presses the hand of the father and mother of the family. Then he salutes at the same manner with his hand all other persons, as many as there may be. And it happens sometimes that he will find a whole room full. Such salutation and handshaking is customary with strangers as well as among most intimate friends. And the mode of addressing each other is among the English as well as the Germans. How are you, good friend? And the answer is, so middling. Now, Middleburg goes on to say this is partly related to natives, but the truth is it owes much more to the Quaker practice. Quakers, Fox and others, they would make an effort to shake hands with an individual. And they would reach forward with the other hand and grasp the forearm. And they would say, I can feel the life in this individual. And it's this physical manifestation of being drawing into this kind of fraternity, sorority, if you will, to some degree, in Quakerism that is so powerful and so significant. But you look at this in the Quakers at this time in the 1640s, and it's very clear that this is a movement which can fly off, as so many of these radical sectaries did, into different kinds of aberrations and so on. Indeed, it happened. There are different kinds of people who were fellow travelers with George Fox for a while, and who split off with them, and so on. The Quakers were aware, certainly, that they wanted they needed some degree of order in all this. You've got to create order. You can't simply open the lid and let everything fly out. If you do, as I say, the centrifugal force is so great that it will change the nature and destroy the nature of the society. What did they do? Well, they established very early, and you begin to see this in the 1650s, the establishment of what they called general meetings, as well as meetings for worship. And these general meetings gave some kind of coherence to their identity, if you will, and created some kind of ability for them to cooperate and to get along. The general meetings, they were business meetings, monthly meetings, an aspect of the Quaker monthly meeting. They handled fines, they posted bail, they handed out money to the poor. They tried to figure out how to finance the itinerants, those public friends who went around. They also handled questions of what we would call gospel order. That is, how should one explicate the doctrine that began to develop not only out of any systematic treatises, but really out of Fox's kind of statements and the statements of other leaders and so on, and some of the things that they published. How can you put together something that has coherence? And they also created a kind of church structure, although they wouldn't have called it that, but a meeting structure, which allowed for interchange among groups. What they then were able to do, and you see it, and I think these are two of the most important things, they really began to control print. They began to, and remember, in late 17th century, there's a lot of control of print, of public print, and what Quakers try to do is in the earlier period, in the 1640s, 1650s, there's this great efflorescence of publications because these controls are not exacted in some way. There's been a breakdown at that point. But what the Quakers do is try to exercise their own control. And they try to harmonize the message to some degree. And they were only partially successful in that. And of course, what they did, they tried to spread their message through itinerancy. In the 1660s, again, this determination to have some kind of order, this effort to have some kind of order, it increased, because they'd come to the view with the Restoration in 1660 of the Stuart monarchy. They come to the recognition that this new kind of revolution, if you will, the days of the universal church and so on, this was not going to happen. The issue was we're in a different kind of world. And what reinforced that was the fact that in the 1660s, they became the most persecuted sect in England. Post-Restoration, England, of course, had some room for what we call dissenters, a number of particularly Presbyterian and Congregational Calvinist kinds of organizations. The Quakers were outside the pale. They were much too radical for this. And they because of their emphasis on the kind of divine light as the source of inspiration, because they objected to the Trinity and to other doctrines, they're seen as outside the pale. They also were suspect at this time as being possibly revolutionaries, because the whole ethic of pacifism that becomes much more powerful in the 18th century and so important, it isn't there at the beginning. There are a whole bunch of Quakers that fought during the Civil War, and there was this whole issue of what pacifism meant, what was involved in it. how you drew the line between personal pacifism and your obedience to the state and so on. These are issues which Quakers, in effect, are still arguing about in the 1660s. What happened was that there was a rebellion in England, or a protest by Thomas Venner and his fifth monarchist in 1661. And because Quakers had been seen as being of martial nature in some way, many of them were swept up. And in fact, thousands were incarcerated. Hundreds died. And part of the problem was that, again, Quakers wouldn't take an oath. It gets back to this unwillingness to take an oath. They stand the ground on what they believe. And that is that puts them in this position where they are, in effect, this persecuted sect. And it's in the midst of this, by 1667, that Penn gains conversion. And this is the environment, an environment in which there are issues of stabilizing what Quakers mean. And indeed, Penn, Robert Barclay, William Keith, these are the kind of second generation of Quaker leaders who played a huge role in developing a kind of ordered kind of Quakerism in the later part of the century. Now, in fairness, Barclay eventually split, and Keith caused all kinds of trouble. Penn essentially is the central figure in creating a kind of much more orthodox, and a number of people who were associated with him, kind of view of what Quakerism was, and partly institutionally what he wanted to do, and was in league with, of course, was creating a yearly meeting at the apex of the meeting structure, which would provide against some kind of order. It provided a kind of structure for guidance for the local meetings. Ministers, public friends, in other words, and eminent people like Penn and others could participate in these and could begin to centralize to some degree, work against the centrifugal kind of force that was there. The other things that happen, and I think these are really important, it's this issue of the individual who is seized by this kind of sense of spirituality and under a kind of urge to declare what he or she felt the truth to be. Quakers came to a position in the 1660s and the 1670s, a little later, that the individual spiritual identity could only flourish within an intensely regulated community setting like the meeting. In other words, you can't get up and say, hey, I believe this. Now, you might still wander into a Baptist church and take on the minister, but in terms of your own kind of religious environment, your first obligation as an individual, if you felt that you had a concern, and that's the word that Quakers used, if you felt that you had a concern, then, in fact, your first obligation is to go to the meeting and possibly talk to one or two trusted friends. But it's only in this kind of community structure that the individual can fulfill that kind of sense of individual identity. It's individualism within community. And I want to come back to this later, because I think this is really important for liberalism, if you will, and pluralism. The individual then experience took on meaning only in the context of a group experience. What you have then, too, is you've got, in theory, you've got an unlimited church because of your postulation that individuals have essence within them, all individuals, that's potential. But in practice, there's a limitation. There's a limitation in terms of what can be said, and there's a limitation in how you can reach people. So that Quakers see this as you see them develop in this way, and I think that whole issue of Quaker radicalism, yet within a kind of community context. And here, in these early years, what they're thinking about largely is the meeting context. But But what you can see is that this gets carried on over into a civil context at a later date, particularly in Pennsylvania. And I think that's the connection I want to make, just to give it away, as it were. Okay, well, Penn comes along as a leading figure. He's converted in 1667, and very quickly he reaches. I mean, he comes from an eminent family, as we know, as Walter mentioned. His father's an admiral, and so on. I mean, this is a person with status. He's part of the court. He's a personal friend of James II. This is a person who, he's the uncharacteristic Quaker. This is. I mean, he really is an aberrant kind of figure in that sense. And he's aberrant in another way, in that more than any, he was extraordinarily facile with the pen. He wrote a huge number of pamphlets and played a huge part in consolidating quite a Quaker kind of beliefs and polity. But he partly because of his status, he didn't shy away from contention in the most important kind of way. And what we find when if you look at Penn, and one of the things that'll come to mind immediately, or come to the surface immediately, is that in 1670 he got involved in what was known as the Penn-Mead trial, and in it, what he had defended essentially, what Penn defended was liberty of conscience, the right, in fact, for different religious beliefs or different religious groups to practice as they wished, and to essentially be able to demonstrate that they could, in effect, be good citizens. They could be part of a very stable and ordered polity at the same time as they practiced different religious practices. What Penn said essentially was this: the whole effort to establish religious uniformity creates far more trouble than any possible freedom of religion or give people freedom to practice whatever religion they want possibly could. Penn gets away from the idea of coercion. He says that essentially there's Caesar's world, which is the civil world, and there's God's world. And that the magistrates who operate in Caesar's world have essentially no right to prescribe religious practices, nor should they, from the matter of practical politics, because that's God's way. And in the great case for liberty of practice that he mentions, here, let me read from the first paragraph where he sets out his terms. First, by liberty of conscience, we understand not only a mere liberty of the mind. Liberty of conscience is not just a liberty of the mind in believing or disbelieving this or that principle or doctrine, but the exercise of ourselves in a visible way of worship, upon our believing it to be indispensably required at our hands, that if we neglect it for fear or favor of any mortal man, we sin and incur divine wrath. In other words, it's not just quiet practice of private belief. In some ways, the Low Countries, the Dutch in the Low Countries were already practicing this. They practiced what was called connivance, which essentially meant as long as you kept out of sight, you say, well, practice what you wanted. What Penn wants to do essentially is establish the right of people to publicly worship, and that is an important kind of right. It's an inalterable kind of right. It exists in God's world, not in the human world, in a sense, and that essentially is what needed to be given for the sake of, again, peace, order, a kind of civil life, a civil existence. I mean, this was a man who recognized, the persecution of friends. He knew a good deal about the kind of violence that existed on the continent. He knew, for example, that the New World, and when you get on, when we move on to the 1680s, in the New World, it's rife with violence in so many different ways. much of that whole area, up Pennsylvania south, actually Virginia south, if you look at it, it's in some ways beyond the line, away from the conventions of European practice. It's a world of piracy and extraordinary coercion, violence in all different forms. And what Penn says, look, part of the problem is religious. I was looking at some of the other issues, but part of the problem is religious, and what you want to do is give people the freedom, the right, in a sense, to practice as they wish, practice their religion as they wish. So Penn takes this view. He develops it in England in these contexts. He goes on in different ways to. He would also argue, I would say that and here this is the interesting thing. Yes, religious practice is a very important independent kind of activity of government, and one should tolerate it, one should accept it, one should be part of the establishment. But he also believed that religion involved some kind of discipline, and you couldn't be a covert kind of religious practitioner. And here he's thinking particularly the papists, the Catholics. You can't have a political agenda. And Catholic allegiance to the Pope was seen as a political agenda because it had implications for the civil world. But you can't have that kind of practice. That's intolerable. Now, interestingly enough, in practice in Pennsylvania, of course, there was a Catholic church by the 1740s. There was considerable on-the-ground tolerance. But nonetheless, there are limits out there. But more than anything, what Penn says, of course, is that governance is really important, but it's important because it establishes certain kinds of practical kind of religion. And in some ways, here he's a precursor of Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography. I mean, what he's essentially saying is we ought to concentrate on those things that are common within a religion. In other words, what he's saying, we ought to concentrate on morality. And that's what's really, really important in terms of government. These are the things then that Penn brings to Pennsylvania. And again, in some of the documents, I've given you a number of documents that are produced in the 1680s. And some by Penn, others by one or two other observers, one or two by early German settlers. And what they repeat essentially, and here I'll quote Daniel Pastorius of Germantown, notwithstanding the aforesaid, William Penn belongs to the sect of tremblers or Quakers, yet he constrains no one to my religion, or to any religion, but leaves to each nation freedom of belief. You see this again and again in the literature which deals with colonization and Penn's entrepreneurial effort to recruit people for this colony. He said, look, freedom of religion. This is what you have. And it gets repeated again and again. This is what you get. And again, if you look at Middleburger in here, I mean, he emphasizes the same thing. And he talks about the consequences of this. How in Philadelphia there's this church, that church, and whatever church, he misses a couple, but nonetheless, the important thing is what Penn promises is this kind of religious. It's not just tolerance, because tolerance suggests that it can be overridden at a certain point. What he promises is a kind of religious liberty, freedom to practice your religious practices as you choose, freedom to worship as you wish in an open kind of way. And that, along with this kind of entrepreneurial element, is huge. And you watch the way it's picked up on. I mentioned that some account of Pennsylvania was published in German and Dutch and French. Pastorius, of course, comes to Germantown, establishes Germantown in 1683. He brings a number of Mennonites with him. And you see these like-minded kinds of German sectaries who come into Pennsylvania. Rosicrucians, for example. Johann Kelpius brings a number of Church of Brethren and Mennonites. There are Amish, there's Schwenkfelders, there's Dunkers, there's Waldensians, Moravians. I mean, all these different religious groups that come to Pennsylvania, in part because they are simply because they see the attractiveness of it, and because they believe that they share something, this kind of spiritualistic religiosity that they share with Quakers. And yes, they're fragmented. There's no question about that, and they go in different directions. But again, what you see Moravians and others talk about is that they separate to unite. That is, they become a separate entity, but they do so in order to put a greater emphasis upon spirituality, which ultimately would bring them together in a larger kind of sense of tolerance. And again, some still have in their mind the idea of a kind of universal church. So this kind of pietistic presence is extraordinarily important in changing the character of Pennsylvania. It's not just pietists, however, Germans who come to Pennsylvania. It's in fact German church people. Lutherans are Reformed. They began to pile into the province beginning in 1709. They're different depending on how you look at this, whether you appear to origins, you look at shipping records or whatever. You get a different kind of a breakdown of the flow. But nonetheless, I mean, it's pretty clear that in the 18th century, probably as many as 80,000 Germans came to Pennsylvania, and many of them, as I say, are church Germans, not just simply these pietistic members of these pietistic sects. The result is, as Mittelberger says, and here's his description, on page 2 of this handout that you do have, we find there, meaning Pennsylvania, Lutherans, Reformed, Catholics, Quakers, Mennonites, or Anabaptists, Herrenhutters or Moravian Brethren, Pietists, Seventh-day Baptists, Dunkers, Presbyterians, Newborn, Freemasons, Separatists, Freethinkers, Jews, Mohammedans, Pagans, Negroes, and Indians. Big raft of people. And this is what has happened. This is what this has resulted in. And this is just one group. I won't go into the reasons. I mean, there are reasons specifically why German church people from the Palatinate came. They had to do with local conditions and the background of war and rack renting and so on that went on, and the consolidation of the state in some of these principalities in the 1700s. But so there were push factors. There's no question about that from the continent. But you can't get away from this pull factor. The issue of land, the issue of religious freedom. That's what really drives this in some way, and that begins to create this kind of changing topography of Pennsylvania. The other group I'll turn to just briefly, and Walter has already mentioned them, in conjunction with the Germans. That's the Scotch-Irish. And again, a large number of migrants to Pennsylvania in the 18th century, drawn certainly, well, first of all, I mean, I should go back to 1710. James Logan, again, whom Walter mentioned, this provincial secretary and William Penn's agent, wrote at one point to one of his acquaintances, speaking of Scotch-Irish communities that he knew of. It might be wise, he said, to plant a settlement of such men as those who formerly had so bravely defended Derry and Inniskillen as a frontier in case of any disturbances. So what Logan wants to do, I mean, he's well aware of the fact that Quakers were not going to welcome a traditional militia, but there were a large number of pietists in this world. What Logan essentially says is when he looks out on the western frontier, he sees conflict with natives as a possibility, but he also sees conflict out there relative to between different groups, and possibly between, it already had developed essentially with Delaware and with Maryland on the frontier. There's going to be violence out there in some way or another because of the nature of land titles, and the fact that because when Penn essentially became incapacitated in 1712 and then died in 1718, the whole land policy and settlement process in Pennsylvania collapsed. And fundamentally, there's a kind of disorder out there. What Logan wants to do is encourage the Scotch-Irish. Well, the Scotch-Irish Sure. Once a number of them had established themselves in Pennsylvania, they too found the kind of prospect of living in a colony where there was land available, where it was relatively inexpensive, and where many of them took it up simply as squatters out in the western areas when titles weren't available, but also because of the nature of religious freedom. Because back in Northern Ireland, fundamentally they felt that they had been very much persecuted as a religious group, and we won't go into that today. But the point is that again, that was a kind of driver that pushed them out of there. But again, the issue is the attraction. Finally, there is this issue of governance. What Penn wanted to do, and he makes it very clear in his early kinds of statements. Hang on here. As part of some account of Pennsylvania, he has a section in which he calls the Constitutions. And he sets it out there just as clearly as can be. For the constitutions of the country, the patent shows, that is his patent for Pennsylvania, first, that the people and governor have a legislative power. The people, right in there, the people and the governor have a legislative power so that no law can be made nor money raised but by the people's consent. And secondly, that the rights and freedoms of England, the best and largest in Europe, shall be enforced there. You know, this is his sense is, first of all, he's an unqualified Anglophile in the sense that he believes, of course, that Magna Carta and the other traditional kinds of markers of English government would apply to his colonies. But he also goes another step further, and that is talking about the people. And ultimately, if we were to go further in this, he talks about the franchise, who can vote, and sets out this expectation that there will be participation in this world. And again, Walter mentioned the 1701 Charter of Privileges, and that is crucial on this road. The first couple of constitutional efforts that Penn undertook and others in the 1680s and the 1690s, they involved a considerable amount of wrangling. I mean, Penn was really caught in some way. You know, he made a lot of statements about how, in relationship to Quakers and others, that this would be a kind of partnership. That this was, and to Quakers in particular, that this was partly their province. That they essentially were a part of it, that they owned it, just as he did. And it's that sense of comedy that is really there. And yet, Penn was a proprietor. He wanted to make money out of this place. And so, you know, he goes back and forth. He gives away a lot at one point. Then he, throws that Constitution away. He brings in another. The policies that he tries to encourage on his own behalf militate against what many settlers see, and particularly fellow Quakers see as the kind of promises that he had made. But in 1701, Penn's already on the way to essentially making a deal with the Crown to sell Pennsylvania. And it never is consummated, needless to say, because of his stroke and subsequent illness. But part of the reason for the Charter of Privileges was that he wanted to create a government that would give a good deal of power to, as he would have put it in this term, the people, so that they could defend themselves from the Crown and from those kinds of agencies. Now, that's not the way it played out, needless to say, but what did play out was that the legislature that was established as a part of this Charter of Privilege, or these Charters of Privilege, that it became the dominant kind of institution in Pennsylvania governance. He provided a government, essentially, or the Charter of Privileges provided a government which had a legislature which essentially could control its own adjournment, controlled taxation to a considerable extent, It was elected annually. There was no real role for the council in the standard kind of tripartite organization of royal governments. You have the governor, a council, both of which have significant power, and a legislative assembly. In this colony, the power essentially, or the possibilities for power, lie with the elected assembly. And by golly, that's what the Quakers do. I mean, we go through a period of a kind of interregnum. When Penn's ill, then his wife, Hannah Penn, is a custodian. She tries to give orders to the council to strengthen the proprietorial hand. Can't do it. And ultimately, by the 1720s and the 1730s, you get a kind of second generation or an older first generation of Quakers who are saying, we essentially represent the Quaker kind of mission here. We represent and are the custodians of liberty of conscience. We'll make sure that essentially there is no militia law. We'll make sure that taxes are low. We'll make sure that we serve you because we're constantly looking, and these are the words they used, the minds of our constituents. It's this issue of being close to the community. At one point, I called this Quaker kind of enclave, and indeed it was an enclave because, I mean, think about, here you have an assembly in Pennsylvania run by Quakers, essentially. There are some other denominations that are in it, represented up through about 1739, then a significant number of Quakers who are in control for the 40s and 50s, and then again another period when some Anglicans and Presbyterians come into it as well. But this Pennsylvania legislature is as big as the number of people right here in this section of the room. This is a little group. And what they are essentially is the analog of the meeting. It's the analog of the Quaker meeting. They sit in silence sometimes. There's very infrequently are there votes. They talk about consensus. They wait till they reach something. It's this carryover. And what these Quakers are doing, again, what they're doing is they see themselves as continuing with this kind of William Penn-inspired mission. And it's their mission. And it's very interesting because their identity is tied up with them. Now they're a minority. They're a minority in Philadelphia by 1702. The best count that we've got is that by 1702 in Philadelphia, only about a third of the people in Philadelphia were Quakers. But the point is they were very skillful. Again, let's not underrate them. As population grows, as the Germans and Scotch-Irish come into the backcountry and so on, they underrepresent the backcountry. They gerrymander. And they're very good at using patronage and so on. But at the same time, what they repeat again and again, they go out into the community. And what they say is, look, this is what we stand for. It's no militia. It's freedom of religion. It's the issue of making sure, and this is particularly important, that we represent, and they put it very much in these terms, the whole of the people, all of the people. And what they did essentially, because Penn did have children, by the way, a second generation, who became the proprietors in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, they were apostate Quakers. And fundamentally what they tried to do was pursue the kind of entrepreneurial strand of Penn's thinking. They wanted to milk as much money as they possibly could out of that hinterland and out of their possessions and so on. So they're written essentially out. And Quakers say, look, these people who control the executive, it's not as though you have the crown, which has a legitimacy. These people are a private interest. They're a separate interest. And the council is of no account. We essentially, as representatives within the local legislature, and their enemies would supply the word, you have democratical tendencies. This is a pure republic. This is the kind of world that essentially leads to a liberal democracy, if you will. Now, it's very much used often in those terms as a term of opprobrium at this time. But the practice is very clear. This is, and Walter said, this is the most powerful assembly in the colonies. And it's run by this group of Quakers. Now, how did they do it? Well, partly by maintaining a policy. They said did the right things. They talked to the constituency and so on. And at an earlier, in a book that I wrote, I essentially called this group an oligarchy, an accessible oligarchy. But the emphasis is upon accessible because, they kept in touch with the community. And you see this in terms of what we call Quakerization. And this, incidentally, is not a term that I or anyone else later terms coined. People at the time used it. They talked about how people were Quakerized, people of other denominations, people with different kinds of beliefs. They were brought into the ambit of Quakerism simply because of the dominance of the kind of appeal and the kind of way in which Quakers presented themselves. Quakers were adept at exploiting what I would call the interrelationships or the intersections between the enclaves of ethnic groups that were out in the surrounding hinterland. And even in Philadelphia, there is a kind of an enclave organization there. What they do is they reach out to those enclaves and they create mediating ground. And they're careful in terms of their policies. When they talk about, yes, they're pacifists and they're challenged to some degree, but there are others who were not so fast. I mean, you look at some of these people from out who were Quakers out in the frontier counties. They were involved in marshaling of military supplies and so on. This is a Quaker party which bends, and it bends as a part of the sense of what it is to be custodians of a civil experiment, which involves pluralism, in our words. It involves the bringing together of these different groups. Now, ultimately, they couldn't stand. And the power of the revolution. One of the reasons Quakers are ignored in American history is they became passive. They were designated as traitors in the revolution. The patriots, whatever you want to say, and we'll use that term. Once the mad dog of patriotism gets loose, it will have no kind of moderation. You get into the war. Let's not put a gloss on it. It has that element to it. The revolution is a revolution. It's a civil war. And Quakers were deemed to be loyalists even if they were neutrals. It's that old business, if you're not for me, you're against me. And so Quakers kind of were pushed aside. But the institutions that they practiced or that they put in place, particularly when I'm thinking about the unicameral legislature, you see that carry on into the revolution, taken over by other individuals once that revolution takes place, and it becomes a kind of focal point for what's seen as the democratic thrust of the revolution. Along with that, and again, there are challenges to all of this. And the kind of oaths that were required during the revolution, they were meant to get rid of Quakers and others, but these people can't take oaths. So you push them aside. Now, that's not the practice of pluralism as it had been instituted in Pennsylvania. But there are clearly boundaries there, even among Quakers. And I don't mean to suggest that they epitomized something that was entirely open and welcoming. There were these kind of one of the things that they put emphasis on, the Penn himself put emphasis on, was a test for legislators that they should believe in Christ. There's a kind of Christian element in all of that, and that partly has to do with Quakers being challenged as not being Christians. So you see that kind of element, but nonetheless, the important thing is that there's this tension between inclusion and exclusion that is there. But then we see that all the time. I mean, the whole issue about liberal democracy is who's in and who's out, right? And you can see this in again, look at Middleburger's piece. You'll see, there's a paragraph in there where he deals with different classes of people. And you can see it there very clearly. So the controversy goes on. And the issue of liberal society, pluralistic society, in a sense you can say it's decided because the pluralism is there. Well, okay, but it's the issue of how it's applied, who's in, who's out, and whatever. And I guess I would argue that, as well, and this is, and perhaps as a last word, when you think about this kind of pluralistic heritage and the liberal heritage, what I see in here, and I've always argued that the Quakers are important in contributing to a kind of liberal and individualistic strand in early American history. I think that's very true. But I also think that they represent very markedly something that I think we ought to be and need to be very much aware of. That is, that in their world, individual expression involved a kind of community presence, a community construct, a sense of self-denial, a sense of participating in the larger kind of community for its well-being. In other words, this is not a selfish horse. Well, it's there to some degree. Joseph Galloway, he said, he welcomed private interests, but he said it's a restless friend. And I think that's part of the issue. I mean, how restless is this? Where does it go? How do you? What kind of a framework do you put it within? And what I think Quakers did in large measure was to express to some degree the importance of this and unleash these kinds of forces of equality, of individualism and so on. But they were very careful to create it, to pay as much attention talking about order, boundaries. Now, some of these we would disagree with. But the one I think that we would all recognize as being important is the way in which it puts a kind of limit. These people put a kind of limit on the self. That this is something that needs to be taken care of. That unfettered kind of self becomes, in their terms, a kind of license. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions. I'd also like to remind all the participants that the talks here and the materials here will all be posted at FPRI's website in the weeks following this program, and the 91 pages of PDF files will also be emailed to you directly after the program.
And I might add, if any of you have any questions about any of the stuff that I've sent you, don't hesitate to email me, okay?
I'm curious, were the Quakers, what's the word I'm looking, missionary in nature? Did they reach out to create more converts, or did
No,
or
I
not?
mean, it's very interesting. Of course, in the early years, in the 1640s and the 1650s, 60s, even in the 70s, a little bit in the 80s, they're reaching out. And in Pennsylvania in particular, I mean, this is one of the interesting sides of all this, which I didn't mention, and I meant to, but forgot it. There's a sense in which there's a made in Pennsylvania Quakerism. Because a lot of people come to Pennsylvania and they don't have a religion. Or they did have, but there are no ministers or whatever. And so there's a drawing in of people in the late 17th century and the very early 18th century. By the 1740s, what you begin to see is a turn to exclusivism. And it's called, it's been used in relationship to Puritans, but you also see it, I think, very much in terms of Quakers. There's a tribalism, a Puritan tribalism, a Quaker tribalism that becomes much more interrooted. And it's driven in part by what was called at the time the sober sort of Quakers. The sober sort. The sober sort essentially wanted to purify the church. I mean, most churches have factions that want to purify, but it became particularly powerful in the 1750s around the issues of pacifism and various kinds of what they called testimonies. So you see that kind of tension, and again, it changes over time. But certainly, Quakers became very centered in terms of who they were and exclusive in that sense. The political kind of manifestations of that religious sensibility, I think, remained open right up through one might argue through the Revolution when they get displaced. And I've got one or two friends who are economic historians, and they tell me, I don't know that much about it, but they tell me that Quakers are really powerful figures, both economically and politically, right up to the Civil War in the area, and I think that's probably accurate. So that's another dimension of Quakerism, if you will. It's you can't think about Quakerism as just being a thing. It's a complicated kind of ball of yarn with these different kind of strands, and time makes a difference. Okay, yeah.
I love the idea of the legislature where maybe the Quaker-dominated or Quaker-themed legislature where I can only imagine what a filibuster would be. It would be
Yes, indeed.
I was curious when you talked about the origins of Quakerism and Penn in particular.
Yeah.
My son told me that my son went to Oxford, that Penn was an Oxford student, an Oxford graduate. So did Oxford allow Quakers, given their ostracism during that time, or did young students, sort of radicals, turn to it?
I actually thought he'd gone to Oxford before he converted, but I could be wrong. I mean,
So how did he get converted? What was...
Thomas Lowe was the minister who converted him. I mean, Penn had been banished to his family's Irish lands, and he was 23 when he was converted. And Thomas Lowe, I don't know, this very persuasive Quaker minister, came and essentially converted him. Now, how did this take place? I mean, look, I don't know, but it happened. There clearly was an element of that kind of religious sensibility in the man at an early age. We all have, I shouldn't say that, a number of us have children who at the ages of late teens and early 20s can take some interesting twists and turns. Sir?
You described the legislature as something of an oligarchy. I'm wondering how people got on that legislature. Were they elected? Were they church leaders or meeting leaders?
I'm terribly sorry. I should have made. They're elected, and there's a very look. You're talking about a small population, so people emerge as kind of community leaders first of all, and then this is again a part I had to mention, but I didn't. But by the 1730s and 1740s, particularly the 1740s, there really is what I've called a kind of party structure that develops. And people are recruited within a kind of political arena. Now, there are proving grounds for them. I mean, for example, sheriffs are elected, and you can serve as a sheriff. You might serve as a county commissioner. It's not really a cursus honorum by any means, but there is a kind of way in which people are selected out. But again, the dynamic is we have to think about the scale. It's like the assembly being so small. The communities were small too, and that helped, people of talent rise up, just as public friends were identified by the public interaction that took place. Yes?
Hold on.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Earlier you mentioned women.
Yes.
As public friends.
Yes.
And so as Quakerism came to Pennsylvania, in any of the papers do we see any reference to women becoming public in the civic life as opposed to just the spiritual life?
Yeah, it's really interesting. First book I wrote, I had a paragraph in it talking about a woman by the name of Jane Hoskins and another one by the name of Susanna Wright, who had been involved in political manipulation of the ticket and whatever. And the person who read the manuscript said, "Can't be so, impossible." But they did. Now there's Susanna Wright. You find that they were. I mean, those were there were two examples. There may be one or two others I can't remember at this stage. But yes, but it's not. These are exceptional kinds of cases. I mean, it was Susanna was supposed to. This is somebody who came from out at Columbia on the Susquehanna. She was reputed to have gotten up on the second floor of a tavern and handed out election tickets. So, yes.
We have time for one last question.
This may be a long one. You did not talk very much about blacks and slavery in the beginnings of Philadelphia. Am I correct? The Quakers, even though, as you just said, they were absolutely against coercion, but they did practice slavery, I think, until about the 1730s when they finally changed their mind. You want to comment on that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are Quakers different minds right from the beginning on this. One of the most famous statements against slavery, early statements, is the Germantown Statement of 1688. There are people, and there are protesters, Benjamin Lay and others, John Woolman is probably the one that's best known, Quakers who spoke out against Quakers. But there were a large number of Quakers, for example, down in, I shouldn't say large, but there were a number of Quakers down in the West Indies who were involved not just in the slave trade, but owning. And there were a number of Quakers, both in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, who were deeply involved in the slave trade. So the meetings don't make public testimonies against the slave trade until the 1750s. And then it's really the 1760s and 1770s before they start to get rid of it. The issue is again, has to do with who's in and who isn't. And that's a really complicated issue, but Quakers, there's a significant number of Quakers who accept this institution very clearly. There are a number of them who don't. Those who don't deny they say essentially this, they deny the institution, or they renounce the institution for religious reasons. And that's what really changes in some way. Quakers always have this kind of religious sensibility relative to slavery, which you see more developed in the Revolutionary years and afterwards. But their motivation is religious frequently, not the kind of natural rights kind of language that we see coming out of once the Revolution is articulated. But later in antebellum America, Quakers become important parts of the anti-slavery kind of movement.
Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.